I want to start off in our series, America the Conquered, by reading a small piece that came out of a paper that someone mailed to me. And much of the material that I use in these sermons come from people mailing things to me. They're very valuable to me. It says, first the flag, now the anthem. Grand Rapids, Michigan. Paul Kidwell would like to see Manfred Mann replace Francis Scott Key as the man associated with the national anthem. Kidwell will perform a group to promote. Kidwell has formed a group to promote replacing the Star-Spangled Banner with "Do-Wah-Diddy." It was a real hard choice between that and another of my favorites, Mac the Knife, said Kidwell, founder of America Changed the Anthem. Now Kidwell said the anthem is stodgy, staid, not easy to dance to, and frankly maybe the worst song ever written. I thought that was interesting because one wonders how much God has to bring upon Israel, how much degradation, how much insult has to come upon us before we finally turn. They're already burning our flag. Now can you imagine the national anthem as the flag is burning? Do-wah-diddy-diddy-doon-da-dee-dum, or something like that? Well, I think it's appropriate. It's amazing what God can bring about. He's patient. His wheels grind slowly. It's also amazing how much we'll take before we'll even admit that we've been conquered. The proposition of the whole series of messages on America the Conquered is basically proofs, Bible and otherwise, that we are conquered. All you have to do is begin to observe around us in our society, and the signs of conquest are everywhere, but no one's saying anything about it. I hope this message isn't going to be too dull for you because I got a series of exhibits to cover. Signs about us that show that we are conquered. I'm a preacher. I observe people. I observe signs. I notice the bumper stickers. I don't know if you do or not. There is one bumper sticker that is everywhere, at least in this part of the United States. And I've seen it back east also and in the west, further on in the west. And that's a bumper sticker that's got two words. The first word is a four-letter word. It starts with S-H. And the last one is happens. How many know what I'm talking about? You see it everywhere. The S-H four-letter word happens. And I thought to myself, you know, what that is a sign. It's a statement made by slaves. Now, there's another bumper sticker that someone came out with. It's entitled "Blessings Happen." How many have seen that? And I thought to myself, little do they realize that they're dealing with the prophetic blessings and curses of Scripture. And I'm preaching without a Bible. Without a Bible. Well, it's like going to battle without a sword, isn't it? Turn to Deuteronomy, chapter 28. Verse 15. But it shall come about, if you will not obey the Lord your God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I charge you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Now what you see in that bumper sticker, the SH four-letter word, is simply a word that has been replaced, that has been used to replace curses. They just as well say curses happen. That's what they're saying. And they have happened, just like God promised. Blessings happen, certainly. If you notice in verse 1 it says, "Now it shall be, if you will diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments, which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, if you obey the Lord your God." And there it is. One bumper sticker saying the curses happen, the other bumper sticker saying the blessings happen. The law is in the heart of Israel. They don't quite understand it. They might not have it in exact Bible terminology, but they got it right there on their bumper stickers, not even realizing what's happened to them. And if you look at verse 44 of Deuteronomy 28, God has said, that these curses would follow them a long, long time. If you look at verse 45, correction. So all these curses shall come on you, and pursue you, and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you would not obey the Lord your God by keeping his commandments and his statutes which he commanded you. And they shall become a sign and a wonder on you and your descendants forever. Notice that he said, these curses will come upon you. But not just you. They'll follow your people, your descendants, wherever they go. And they have followed them all the way to America. And now we have the curses. And if you read on, it says in verse 47, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and a glad heart for the abundance of all things, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord shall send against you, in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, in the lack of all things, and he will put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as the eagle sweeps down a nation whose language you do not understand. What's he talking about? He's talking about the ultimate in curses. Conquest, captivity, the iron yoke. A nation whose language you do not understand. We think of it being some foreign nation coming in and we can't understand that language. You know, we have a nation within our nation that have their own way of talking. They communicate to one another and we still haven't figured out what they're saying. The Goyim don't understand, but the conquerors do. The signs are everywhere, and I want to address some more of the signs, proofs, if you will, that we're conquered. Perhaps before I do that, I should take an exhibit, a writing from Samuel Adams, a writing he did on liberty in the year of 1750, at age 28. He said this, we must not conclude merely upon a man's haranguing about liberty, and using the charming sound that he is fitted to be trusted with the liberties of his country. The sum of all is we must truly enjoy, the sum of all is, if we must, it's hard to read their writings. The sum of all is, if we would most truly enjoy this gift of heaven, let us become a virtuous people. What happens when you're not a virtuous people? It happens. They say SH happens. No, the curses happen. More biblical term. Children have always historically been victims of conquest. In Matthew 24, Jesus made a statement when I believe he was referring to the siege of Jerusalem that took place in 70 A.D. He said, woe unto those who are with child and to those who nurse babes in those days. And I believe what he's talking about there is not for you not to have children because something might be rough down the road. But what he's really talking about there is that if you're caught in a military siege, a conquest, and you have babies, children, it's a lot worse. Because those innocent little children are the ones that have historically suffered from conquest. Now when you understand that principle, you'll begin to understand a lot of things that are going on in our country. Historically, and you don't have to go back very much in history, it's true. Children suffer. I think of the stories that Colonel Jack Moore has shared regarding his captivity there in North Korea, regarding his experiences, what he witnessed when the communists came in an attempted military coup and took over the city. Do you remember the stories? Perhaps if you're listening to the tape, you should shut this off and listen to it without children around first before you really want to play it. But I'm going to relate some of his stories. He talked about how he witnessed with his own eyes a pregnant woman ripped open and her baby taken out of her. He told how he saw with his own eyes soldiers taking a woman's child and throwing the child up into the air and catching it on the end of a bayonet and throwing it from bayonet to bayonet. You say, preacher, how could you even talk about such things? That happened over there in a conquest far away. It would never happen here in America. My friends, it's happening right now. Children suffering in a conquest, and we don't understand it. Historically, it's true when we look from a Bible perspective. Turn to the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus chapter 1, we read of a conquered people and what happened to their children. Starting with verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live. Now there is example of what happens to children once Israel's conquered. They're subject to the whim of the conqueror, whether or not they live or they die. Dropping on down to verse 22, you know the story of the midwives. They did not cooperate, barely got out with their lives. Verse 22, it says, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So here we see examples, Bible historical examples, that children suffer when the people are conquered. You suppose that those midwives, had they carried out the objective of their master, you suppose they would have been rewarded by their master? You know they would have. They barely got out with their lives, if you think about it. They lied to the king. He was unhappy, so he went to stage 2 as far as getting rid of the children. But I noticed that the system is rewarding those that are killing our children today. Here's an article that someone sent to me called Medical Field Honors Abortion Pill Maker. New York. America's most prestigious medical award was given Wednesday to the developer of the controversial French abortion pill, a decision criticized by anti-abortion activists. Now the article goes on to say that it's not yet legal in America, but it does say that America's scientific community has awarded a high honor to the man that developed the pill that will throw the babies into the River Nile. Well, it might not be the River Nile. It might be the Mississippi, or it might be the Platte, or it might be the Missouri. Wherever the sewer lines from the abortion clinics flow, you see, they flow through the sewers of the abortion clinics into our rivers, into the septic systems. You tell me what's the difference. And the system is rewarding those that would kill our children. Now hopefully, when you think about this, you begin to look at abortion in America today in a different light. Pharaoh didn't use abortion. Why? He didn't have the technology. He used the River Nile. You can be sure that there were an awful lot of fat alligators in the River Nile when the Hebrew babies were floating down it. Just as you know, there's an awful lot of fat-walleted murderers called doctors today, because our children are suffering in this captivity. Turn to Ezekiel 36. You say, well, this abortion couldn't be planned. Notice that in Ezekiel, we see a prophecy about Edom versus Israel. In verse 5, we see that Edom had appropriated the land for themselves. It says, therefore, thus says the Lord God, surely in the fire of my jealousy I have spoken against the rest of the nations and against all Edom, who appropriated my land for themselves as a possession, with wholehearted joy and with scorn of soul, to drive it out for prey. And so the conqueror here, the possessor here, was this group called Edom. It's interesting, the word means red. The Reds have always been the enemies of Israel, just as are the red communists today. And in verse 12 it says, yes, I will cause men, my people Israel, to walk on you, speaking of Edom, and possess you, so that you will become their inheritance and never again bereave them of children. Notice that Edom had not only conquered them, not only appropriated land that had belonged to them, but Edom was bereaving these people of children, keeping children from them. That's part of conquest. How's it done? I wondered, how do you get people to throw their babies into the River Nile? Well, how do you get people to abort their babies, keep from conceiving children, and so forth? I suppose there's several ways, and I suspect that Pharaoh used them just as they're used today. You can condition the people. Convince them such things as overpopulation. Remember a few years back, you kept hearing about overpopulation. Starving children in India. How overpopulated they're over there. Those people are not starving because of overpopulation. Those people are starving in India because of an ungodly, unbiblical economic social system, an unbiblical religious system that allows their fat cows and rats to live and eat the grain while the people starve in the streets. It's interesting to note that you can take all the people in the world, divide them in families of 4, put them in a 3-bedroom house, give them a lot, something like 60 by 120 feet, enough to grow a garden, and you can put every person there is in the world right there in a space smaller than Texas and have the rest of the world empty. We're not overpopulated. You ever drive across Wyoming, Nevada? Or you condition the people to believe, well, you want a career, baby. You've come a long ways, baby. Yeah, you've come a long ways, baby, a long ways from God's Word, where He says it's blessed to have children of your youth. Notice He says of your youth. Well, just wait. Go ahead and have your career, do your fun. You can have children later. Oh, yeah? All of a sudden people find out it's not so very easy to get pregnant later. It's easier earlier. God's plan works. And then, of course, economics. Maybe it was just economically advantageous for the people conquered there in Egypt to throw their children into the river Nile. Just as many people find it more economically advantageous to abort a child or to keep from conceiving a child than they do in having children. Why? Because they're economically conquered. The Baal priests, they always play a role in this. As we read old conquests in Israel's history, we read about the Baal priests. Oh, every good Bible scholar knows about the Baal priests who offered their children in the arms of Moloch, how the babies were held out there, and it was part of a religious thing to have that child burned on the arms of Moloch over the flames as they blew the trumpets. But those Baal priests still exist today. In this book that I'm reading called Paradise Restored, I want to read an example here. It says the basic issue has to do with your attitudes towards the future. I recall a Jesus People newspaper of the early 1970s which carried an interview with the most popular prophet expert of those days. On the basis of the fact that Jesus was going to rapture His church at any moment, this man actually counseled his young followers not to marry and raise children. What that man was doing, even though he claimed to be a Christian, was the role of a Baal priest. How many Baal priests have you ever heard get up in front of young people and say, hey, take it from me, take it from the Word of God, get married young and have children? Have you ever heard that? No, it's more fashionable to establish a singles ministry. Or another way they do it is by their false teachings. They actually promote the immorality just like the Baal priests of old promoted immorality. By the saying of, sin now, get saved later. They don't say it in that many words, but they teach it to our young people. They'll take some young person that's been a whoremonger, a dope addict, and whatever else you can think of, and supposedly he found Jesus, or they'll take some old whore that's all burned out, and she's found Jesus, and they'll put them up, and then they promote these people as the ones who, hey, Jesus saved, Oh, I had it all. I had the penthouse and the jets and the Playboy life, but let me tell you something. It's nothing compared to Jesus. I found Jesus now. And what does that do to the young mind? It convinces them they can have their cake and eat it too. Have you ever seen a Baal priest take a young man or a young woman who lived their lives honorably before God, honored father and mother, studied the Scriptures, worked hard, never went out as a hellion, was faithful to their God from their youth up, and say, now here's the example? No, they don't take that for an example. They take this other sinner over here, supposedly found Jesus. And what that does, in the church, the facts are there. They lose their young people all the time. What it does is it tantalizes that young person with forbidden fruit. They say, well, I'll cram for the finals later. I'll find Jesus later. But I'll tell you what happens along the way. you lose something that you can never get back. You lose an ability even to have a close walk with God that the other person will have that you can never have. And you'll have scars that will follow you for life. And one of those scars beginning to show up, infertility. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. You want to sow your wild oats? Go ahead. But see if you reap any babies. And if you do, see if you're able to keep them. And the reason that happens is because of the Baal priest's role in the matter. And then we pass laws, just like Pharaoh did, that allow it and protect those men that cast the babies in the river Nile. What do you suppose, since we're talking about abortion, what do you suppose would have happened to those people in Egypt, the good godly Israelites that were there, had they gone out in unison to the river Nile and held hands together and began to sing and protest and stood in front of the men that threw the babies into the river Nile? What do you suppose would have happened? What do you think that cold, hard-hearted Pharaoh would have done? Oh my, what are we going to do? Guess we've got to stop throwing babies into the Nile. Look, we can't go through these people. Do you think that conqueror would have responded to those people that way? Suppose they had an Operation Rescue right there on the river Nile, singing as we gather at the river. What do you think Pharaoh's police are going to do? The same thing that they do today with Operation Rescue People. Here's an article that was sent to me. It's called Pittsburgh Police, Prison Guards Beat and Assault Pro-Life Women. Now, about 40 minutes ago, I called back in Pittsburgh to confirm this story with a lady by the name of Judy Dick, 448 Geisler Drive, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 15221. I also got a second witness. I wasn't able to get a hold of that person because of time, but I said I want 2 witnesses. So as I share this story with you, I've given the address of the person at the bottom of it, but I want you to know I'll check out the second witness too. If it's not true, I'll cut it out of the tape. Let me read some of the things that's happened here. It says on March 11th, 124 people, 60 women and 65 men, sat in front of the entrance to an abortion mill on Pittsburgh Highland Avenue. And then it begins to talk about the abuse they received from the police. I'll just skip over parts of it and read portions. Once they were loaded into buses with tinted windows so outsiders could not see in, the police removed their badges and name tags and went to work. Bad as this was, far worse awaited our women when they arrived at the Allegheny County Jail. There they were thrown off the buses, their heads were slammed on the cement and then dragged up the steps, usually by their hair, clumps of which were pulled out, and into the jail. They were taken not to the women's jail, but to the men's jail to be held. At the top of the steps, Charles Kozłowski, warden of the Allegheny County Jail, awaited them. As each woman was dragged past him, he would deliberately kick them in the back or stomach. The warden took an older woman aside and without provocation bent her fingers back to the wrists. When the other women protested he was breaking her fingers, he laughed and continued to press her finger back. The warden was also seen sexually molest a young girl. The city police and the prison guards, who also removed their badges to hinder identification, began to drag the women up 5 flights of stairs. This was done with great brutality, usually by the hair or neck. Heads could be heard smacking against the steps as they were pulled, not carried. Most of their clothing was stripped off, leaving them naked from the waist up. They were kept in this condition for a considerable length of time and prevented from covering themselves. At least 2 women were stripped and dragged up and down a corridor in front of cells filled with regular male inmates while the police and guards laughed and made obscene remarks. All this time and throughout their prison stay, the women, young girls from a Catholic university, and older respectable married women were subjected by the guards to a constant torrent of the vilest, filthiest language imaginable. The guards continually threatened them with rape, with sodomy, even death threats were made. They were told they would be thrown into a cell full of male prisoners and they, the guards, would watch while they were raped. These threats were made using extremely obscene and graphic language. The next morning, the women were taken to Mayfield State Mental Hospital before leaving Allegheny County Hospital, and they were told by the guards that if they did not get up and walk and had to be dragged, some of them might be killed. I'm just skipping over portions. What happened in Pittsburgh is only a part of what appears to be a pattern of increasing harshness towards pro-life rescuers by the authorities. Rescues in Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Diego, Shrewsbury, New Jersey, West Hartford, Connecticut have been attended by police terrorist tactics including breaking bones, concussions, torture holds, and the like. In the courts, the judges are handing out stiff sentences. And I thought to myself, you notice the tone of this? They're saying, man, they're treating us terrible. How could this be in America? They don't realize that this is the right of the conqueror. Don't get in his way as he takes your children out of the way. Does that make sense? Turn over to Matthew chapter 2. Still looking at Bible history. Verse 16 and 17. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very angry, or very enraged, and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its environs, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had ascertained from the Magi. These people were conquered. They were a conquered people, and the conqueror decided he wanted to kill some of their babies. And so our conqueror decides, we'll take your tax money and we'll pay for aborting the babies. You tell me, what's the difference? It's part of conquest. And of course, it's part of what goes on in conquest. Going back to this article, I want to read it here. It says, actions like these lend color to the belief of many that there is a conspiracy on the part of the abortionists and the political elements, police, prosecutors, judges, and others. They control to break the back of the pro-life rescue movement by a kind of police and judicial terrorism. Oh, you think so? We're beginning to get smart, aren't we? If you are shocked and disgusted by what was done to our pro-life women in Pittsburgh, you can do something. Well, now, what do you suppose a slave can do? Well, they say you can phone, you can write letters to the following, demand they investigate, that they take action, and then they list everything from the FBI to the Civil Rights Commission and so forth. And I asked on the phone, this was some time back, took place, I said, has anything happened? No. They've been stonewalled. Media won't cover it. Prosecutor ignores their complaints and so forth. They haven't figured out that they are just slaves. They've been conquered. You can go to Farrell and protest the alligators getting fatter and the rough tactics of Operation Rescue sit-ins that take place, but they'll do no good. There's a passage in Proverbs perhaps we should look at. Now, I hope it doesn't seem inconsistent as I read this, but the truth of the matter is it's true what it says. When I say, I hope I don't seem inconsistent, I still, in certain areas, encourage writing senators and so forth. But notice what it says here. Verse 19, a slave will not be instructed by words alone, for though he understands, there will be no response. I like King James translation, it says a servant. A servant will not be instructed by words alone. In other words, a public servant will not respond just by some public protesting words alone. He's got to have something that he feels. Now, if a politician thinks it's going to affect his vote, you can get something done. But if you've got a bureaucrat that thinks he's in a position that he can't be touched, go ahead and write your letters. Go ahead and make your phone calls. Go ahead and protest and see if it does any good, you conquered slaves. You haven't figured out that you're conquered. And along with this comes an increase in police power. Those are policemen that are doing that. And someone says, just like they said in the days of Herod, when they walked up and said, how could you kill a 2-year-old baby? The response was, ma'am, I'm just doing my job. I'm just doing my job. It's like all of a sudden, that is an okay. That justifies it. They were just doing their job when they drove the nails into the hands and feet of Jesus. They were just doing their job when they killed the 2-year-old babies and under. Prostitutes just doing their job too. Pimps are just doing their job too. And so are mafia thugs just doing their job. But isn't it about time we do the right job and the right thing? It's time to stop doing our job and doing what's right. It's wrong to see the police powers increasing in America as they are. When I was in Pulaski, Tennessee, just a few weeks back, and I witnessed military aircraft in the air, state troopers, 100 cars lined up, lights going, policemen marching in unison with their riot helmets on and their billy clubs, hundreds and hundreds of policemen, I thought to myself, these locals do not even know that they're in a police state in Concord. You used to think back in the 50s that was something you'd only see in a Germany film or in Russia. But I wasn't in Germany and I wasn't in Russia. I was in America. We haven't figured it out. And there's been a subtle change that has taken place that is also characteristic of a conquered people. Notice that the title of the policemen have changed. It's gone from, what did they used to be called? Anybody know? Starts, I'll give you a hint, with peace. Right. You college boy back there. Peace officer. What are they called today, Mr. Newman? Law in... That's right, law enforcement officers. Notice the difference? Peace officer to law enforcement officer. There's a big change. The peace officer was hired to keep the peace, to protect us from those who would do us harm, to bring justice to those who would commit common law crimes such as rape and murder and theft. And always in a common law crime there had to be certain elements such as a victim, damages, and intent. But on the other hand, a law enforcement officer, he first of all is not even elected by the people. A sheriff, that's an old Anglo-Saxon term, was called upon by the voice election of the people and could always be removed by those people. He was there to protect the peace. But not so with a police officer. He's hired, and he reports to a chief of police, who in turn reports to a board of directors. We call them city council. And it's a board of directors of a corporation known as a city, and the board is called the city council. And the officers are there to enforce the ordinances of the city or the corporation. Ticket citizens for speeding, or for failure to register a vehicle, or for fastening a seatbelt. Think about it. Fastening a seatbelt. Who's the victim? What's the crime? What's the intent? I'll tell you who the victim is. Your slave masters are afraid that you could get hurt, and you will not then produce as much as the other slaves on the plantation. And so the insurance company says, hey, I think we better have a law that says the Goyim slaves buckle their seatbelt. It's only for your own good, safety, and welfare, my child. And so the law enforcement officer there, he is there to protect and to serve. But the question is, who does he protect and serve? His master, those that pay his paycheck. And if they are told to enforce the seatbelt law, they'll do it. And if it means execution, as they pull you up to the gallows for not having buckled your seatbelt, and you say, how can you execute me for just not having a seatbelt buckled? They'll say, I'm only doing my job. As if that covers it all. Well, I'll tell you something. There's a God and a judge in heaven who's going to do his job. And you best remember that. If you're a police officer and you hear this somewhere and you're infringing upon the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of others. Pharaoh had his boys just doing their job. Herod had his boys just doing their job. And Pittsburgh had their boys doing their job against those people who would dare resist the abortion system. I understand that now they've arrested the man, the head of Operation Rescue. Notice this article. It says, Court okays racketeering laws used against abortion opponents. Imagine, federal racketeering laws. The Christians thought that racketeering laws were for mobsters. And now they're finding that the racketeering laws are being used upon them. Big surprise. It says the Supreme Court yesterday turned away free speech arguments and allowed the use of a federal racketeering law against 26 anti-abortion demonstrators in Philadelphia. The court let stand a successful lawsuit against the protesters by the operators of an abortion clinic in that city. Similar lawsuits, each involving the Racketeering Influenced and Corruption Organizations Act, or RICO, have been filed against anti-abortion activists in cities including Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Brooklyn, and Massachusetts. And it goes on to point out that the man that's the head of Operation Rescue, what's his name, Terry Randall, is going to face 2 years in prison if he doesn't pay his $1,000 fine as a result of being convicted under racketeering. Now, I saw some of Terry Randall's material, watched a video, I read a book that he put out, and in that book he said this. He said, it's time that we Christians begin to act as if abortion is murder. Well, I believe it's murder. And so what were they doing? They get together, and I'm not condemning them. I'm just trying to take us a little further, friends. But they get together courageously and say this is murder, and they hold hands, and they try to stop and block the entrances of the abortion clinics. And all of a sudden they don't understand why they're getting this rough treatment. Don't play around with murderers and think that you're not going to be treated rough. You don't have to be exceptionally smart to figure that out. Do you? This abortionist, I don't know, I don't have the quote now, but I read it in an article, a doctor who said, don't tell me you abortionists believe that abortion is, he said, don't tell me you anti-abortion people believe that abortion is murder. If you believed it was murder, there wouldn't be one stone left upon another in this building. You see, now that doctor wasn't too far off. How are we supposed to respond if we see someone out in the street murdering a little 2-year-old child? Pick up a placard and walk around? Write letters to your senator? Make some phone calls? What would a man of God do? What should be done with murderers? But you can't do it. Why? Because you're conquered. Let's be honest. The most you can do is walk up and down the streets and protest. In this article it said here from the Pittsburgh, it says, the pro-life men also being held had no idea of what was happening to the women. I want to say this, even if they did know what was happening to the women, they couldn't do anything about it, and they wouldn't dare do anything about it. Are you getting the point? Does it come across over there, Milt? You know, you like to stay in this preaching business as long as you can. But we're going to have to start addressing these things. Here's a letter that a lady sent to me. She says, I'm sick of our Christian leaders, churches, truth protectors that sit on the fence. Where are their Christian backbones, their moral standards, their guts? They have lost their saltiness. Where are our Christian soldiers? Why are porno shops still standing? My grandfather and men of my childhood, I'm 68 years of age, would have put their loaded shotguns, would have put their loaded shotguns and gone in and tore down the business and ran those running them out of town. There would then also have been thousands of men, women, and children march on abortion mills and running them out of town. And Christians, all who call themselves Christians, have to join together and take the law of God and do it. Where are all the powers? Where all the power belongs and should never be taken from the hands of we the people. Just a 68-year-old woman wondering, where are the men? Why aren't they doing something? And the answer is simple. The reason they're not doing anything is they're conquered. And they are in the same spot that the conquered men in the book of Lamentations were in. Turn over to Lamentations, chapter 2. Lamentations, the book where Jeremiah is lamenting the condition of his people as a result of their conquest. Notice, starting with verse 10, chapter 2. The elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground. They are silent. They have thrown dust on their head. They have girded themselves with sackcloth. The virgins of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes fail because of tears. My spirit is greatly troubled. My heart is poured out on the earth because of the destruction of the daughter of my people, when little ones and infants faint in the street of the city. And there is the description of where the men were. They sat there, beaten, conquered, as the little children were suffering. And they couldn't do anything because they'd been conquered. Does that make sense? Also note with me chapter 4, verse 21. O Edom was behind her. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, who dwell in the land of Uz. But the cup will come around to you as well. You will become drunk and make yourself naked. Their children were being murdered in the streets, and the men could do nothing about it. And there was O Edom behind it too. I have another section here that I need to cover. I think I have time to cover at least portions of it. Rather than that, let me just go to the second portion of the sermon and cover some other related points. I've covered so far in this portion, this part 5 of this series, how a conquered people have their children suffer as a result of the conquest, and how a conquered people have police powers put over them, and how they can do nothing when they see these things take place. What I want to cover, I think I don't have time, and I'll put it in the next message, is how the aliens fit in and what's happening to the white people in this land. Look in the book of Lamentations chapter 5. Remember, Lamentations is describing what conquest is like. In verse 2, Lamentations 5, it says, Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses to aliens. Now, we don't call them strangers today. We call them minorities. And we don't say the inheritance has been turned over to strangers. We say it's affirmative action in progress or in process. So we'll cover that perhaps in the next message. But look at Lamentations chapter 5, verse 11. Here's something to think about. There's some related points I just want to cover. First of all, in regards to virgins, look at verse 11. It says, They ravished the women in Zion, the virgins in the cities of Judah. Now, this is a characteristic of a conquered people. There are few virgins. The women are ravished, as the scripture says. How many men today are able to join with a woman in holy matrimony and go on to a honeymoon with a virgin? Several years back, I can remember back in the 60s, there was a joke going around. The definition of a virgin, an ugly third grader. Not so laughable anymore, is it? They say 60-some% of the women in this country by the age of 20 are not virgins. You see, that's one of the blessings that God had promised to men of God and to women. You see, they too have been victimized. By what? By a conquest. We don't have the virgins in our land today. Why? It's simple. We're conquered. You think I'm too far out? Well, this is really a positive, uplifting message, isn't it? You know, somebody needs to say it, though. Look at Lamentations chapter 5. Lamentations chapter 4, correction. Verse 3. Even jackals offer the breasts, they nurse their young, but the daughter of my people has become cruel like ostriches in the wilderness. Now there's another characteristic of a conquered people. Women change. They change from soft, feminine creatures that God created them to be, to hard, independent, masculine, cruel people. If you turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 28, you'll notice that this was promised. This was a result of conquest. God promised it to happen when they were conquered. It says in verse 56 of Deuteronomy 28, "The refined and delicate woman among you, who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground for delicateness and refinement, shall be hostile towards the husband she cherishes, and towards her son and daughter, and toward her afterbirth which issues from between her legs, and towards her children whom she bears." Well, notice the change that takes place. Who needs a man? Kids. I don't need a kid. If I get pregnant, I'll just go to the abortion clinic. Isn't that being hostile to that which comes from the woman? Real positive sermon, isn't it? It's called today the woman liberation movement. And it comes with a conquest of a people. The women change. We won't go into why it changed. We won't talk about how maybe they think it's justified, but let me tell you this. It is a change that takes place. So you have a woman that can bring home the bacon and fry it in the pan and shoot a .45 from their hip and do all this stuff. You know, but the thing is, they're not the woman that God really intended them to be. And men, you don't like it? Tough. You're conquered. And the slave mentality begins to develop. I took this out of an article. This is out of a magazine. I think it's it's called Nation. I think it's out of Time. But anyway, it says here, the majority of people said they favor mandatory drug tests for all citizens, police searches of the home, and suspected drug dealers without a court order, and random police checks of cars on the highway. In a Washington Post ABC News poll last week, 62% of those questioned said they would be willing to give up a few of the freedoms we have in this country to reduce illegal drugs use significantly. I don't know if that's really true. I can't trust those particular polls, but it wouldn't surprise me. That's a slave mentality. A slave is not concerned with freedom. A slave is concerned with security. And then we also have not only a change in the police system, but we also have a change in the military that takes place when you're conquered. I'm going to quote something out of this book called The New American Man. This author is describing a situation that took place in his life, and I want to read it to you because I think it shows what's happened in your country, and you might not even know it militarily. A young shooting companion introduced me to a West Point cadet I'll call Nick M. Nick M had been described as having an abnormally high IQ. When I finally met him, Nick M impressed me as someone with a detached, definite attitude towards life. Even his friend, also well endowed with gray matter, was becoming alarmed by Nick's rapid decline into amorality. The three of us spent a day plinking with rifles and pistols in the mountains above Los Angeles in the summer of 1979. As the day wore on, Nick M began to admit to a newly acquired attempt for middle-class values. To a newly acquired contempt for middle-class values. As we drove to a hamburger stand, he recited Hegel and defended Marx's definitions of the dialectic. Later, as we munched on our food, I casually inquired as to the opinions of his military instructors regarding the possibility of our country ever being occupied. "Oh yes, we did have a lengthy discussion on that subject," replied Nick M. "Our instructor explained to us that at the present, the Army cannot occupy this country due to massive private ownership of guns." I hesitated. Of course, I was aware that the academy superintendents and most of the social science instructors at West Point were members of the Rockefeller-owned Council on Foreign Relations, but on the other hand, when the weatherman tells us there's a big storm coming, we're always surprised when it hits. Did you say, I asked, that the U.S. Army cannot occupy us now? Nick M. nodded earnestly. That's right, there are too many guns. Nick, I was talking about the other guys, the Reds. Oh no, our instructors were talking about our side, the Army. I stayed calm. Why would the U.S. Army want to occupy the United States? Nick shrugged. I don't know exactly. Keep order, I guess. But if there weren't so many guns, the Army would occupy the country. Oh, but if there weren't so many guns, the Army would occupy the country? Yeah, that's right. Here he's talking to a West Pointer who has an entirely different concept about the military. Not to protect from foreign invaders, but how do you occupy America? Now this was sent to me recently. A man sent me a picture of the vehicles. You see them there. It says, if you have been by the Murphy, North Carolina National Guard Armory lately, you have noticed that there are 22 new multi-purpose vehicles, MPVs, in the fenced yard. Now they don't have a lot of tanks or heavy equipment to fight off an invading army. But those new MPVs do have blue lights on them. What are blue lights for anyway? Do you use them in times of war to stop a tank of the invading army to ask them for their driver's license? Or would you say that a blue light is for stopping citizens, for military personnel that are subject to such things? With this in mind, I had to find the answer. According to the flyer On Guard for the Best of Your Life by the National Guard Advertising Support Center, quote, when disaster strikes, America calls on the Guard, the only military organization assigned and trained to protect lives and property in state emergencies, end quote. Well, I wanted to know what kind of emergencies they were talking about, so I interviewed Staff Sergeant Larry McGuire of the Murphy, North Carolina Army. For his protection, he didn't want to be directly quoted. However, he did give some answers, very interesting information. When asked about these blue lights, he informed us that the Murphy Armory is Detachment 2 of the 210th Military Police Company of Sylvia, North Carolina, with another detachment of MPs in Franklin, North Carolina. Also, there are 2 other battalions of MPs in Asheville and Greenville, North Carolina. Why so many MPs in western North Carolina? There are no military bases or boot camps or great numbers of military personnel that need to be policed by MPs here. After some friendly conversation, he did let on to the fact that they do have a civil disturbance mission. So there you have it, folks. To those that have eyes to see and ears to hear, in my opinion, the government is more concerned with keeping us in line as they push ever-increasing controls on us than they are in repelling an invading army. It's called conquest. Lastly, still just covering miscellaneouses here, I want to talk about a newspaper article that was in the paper some time back, and I didn't save it. Maybe you read it, about a man, I think it was in Denver, that wanted to tear down his garage. He had an old, dilapidated garage in the back of his house. Kind of an eyesore, maybe a hazard, a fire hazard. So on his day off, he was going to tear it down, and he planned on just tying a rope around it and tying it to his pickup and pulling it down, and then he was going to dismantle it. Well, as time went on, he got ready to do this. Someone came over and said, you have to have a permit. I think it was a city inspector. It says, you have to get a permit to tear down the building. So he went down to get the permit to tear down the building, and they said, you have to have an EPA environmental report before you can tear it down. And I don't remember exactly. I think he went over to get the EPA environmental report. Of course, it wasn't all done in the same day. And they said, before we can issue it, or it was either them or the issuing the permit to tear it down, you have to have an insurance policy. So I went to check out the insurance policy, and it was a horrendous amount of money. And he couldn't afford the insurance policy to tear down his barn or his garage. So he didn't tear it down. Then the city came over and gave him a ticket and fined him for not tearing down a building that is possibly a public hazard. And I thought to myself as I prepared this message, his story came to my mind. I thought, what is that? That's the harassment that a master does to the slave. You don't like it? Tough. You're conquered. Write your letters, make your phone calls, do whatever you want. But until you understand that you've been conquered, and that it's the God of heaven keeping His word, bringing on the curses, there'll be no change. Because those curses have come upon us to bring us very low. You say, well, it certainly is a downer of a message. I agree. It's almost depressing. But I bring it because Jesus said, blessed are those that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And until we begin to mourn enough that we will cry out to our God in repentance, there will be no change. And I don't see any way to bring about that mourning except to preach the truth and let people know exactly where they are. They're not in the land of the free and the home of the brave. They're in the land of the cowards and the home of the slaves that dare not do anything against the master. They'll be harassed, their children will be killed, their women will be ravished. They'll develop a slave mentality, and they'll have an army police force over them until such time they understand what's happened. In part 6, I will try to conclude this, bringing out some points regarding race and nation, also bringing out some points in regards to the only rights that our people can claim today seem to be slave rights. And I'll prove it to you. Let's stand and we'll close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for keeping your word, for being one thing that is stable and sure in a life and a world that is full of lies and uncertainties. To know that you are there, that you've kept your promises, that it's come about, the curses have followed us all the way here, is to also know that you'll keep your promise when you said to your people, if they would humble themselves and repent and turn to you, that you'd forgive and heal their land. Please bless this message wherever it goes to that end and that goal. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen. We're adjourned.